The following article is called Conceptions of Race in World War I by Richard Fogerty. Race and racism were important aspects of World War I for two reasons. First, ideas about race had developed over the course of the 19th century to make the concept one of the most prominent preoccupations of modern Europeans. Second, several of the major belligerents at war between 1914 and 1918 possessed large colonial empires where white Europeans ruled over Africans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders. These two factors came together because a large part of the justification for the possession of colonial territories was the supposed right of superior whites to rule over allegedly inferior non-whites. This in turn led several European combatant nations to make use of their colonial resources, both materials and men, to wage war. Thus, while purely military and political considerations often shaped strategy during the war, ideologies of race and racism also played a role, helping in particular to make the war a genuinely global one. Race and nationalism. By the early 20th century, thinking about race was moving towards a more biological understanding of human difference and its significance, with an emphasis on physical features such as color. But earlier conceptions of racial difference had not disappeared completely, and it was common during World War I for Europeans to speak of national or ethnic differences in terms of race. For instance, many believed that the war pitted the English and French races against the Germanic or Teutonic race. Another area where this kind of national or ethnic understanding of race played a role was in the Balkans, where the war began. Despite numerous similarities and centuries of mixing that created many commonalities among the people of the region, ethnic differences loomed large in the self-understandings of many. Ethnic tension and nationalist aspirations helped ignite the war in 1914, when Serbian nationalists assassinated the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and these same factors were paramount in American President Woodrow Wilson's call for national self-determination during the war and at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Race and colonialism. European colonial possessions, particularly in Africa and Asia, played the most important role in injecting race and racism into World War I strategy. The race factor was most visible in the use of millions of colonial subjects as workers and soldiers. Many Africans and Asians labored and fought in their home territories, as they had done before the war. But hundreds of thousands traveled to new lands to contribute to the war efforts of their colonial masters. Some even traveled to Europe itself. France was the colonial power most enthusiastic about deploying its colonial populations, especially in Europe. Some 200,000 came to France to work in war industries, but even more, some 500,000, wore the uniform of the French army and manned the trenches of the Western Front. Even before the war, military officers like Charles Mangin, an important general during the war, advocated recruiting from the vast reservoirs of men in Africa to strengthen the French army in the face of a larger and more populous Germany. When the war began in 1914, soldiers from North and West Africa began arriving in France and played an active role in the fighting. Eventually, soldiers from Indochina and Madagascar also served in France. These men were often very popular among the French people, although many in France regarded non-Europeans through a haze of racial stereotypes. For instance, Black West Africans were popular and celebrated for their courage and loyalty, but also experienced discriminations as they were denigrated for being primitive and having mental inferiority. Race, religion, and global strategy. The most obvious case of colonial considerations helping to shape strategy in the war was the attempt of Germany to exploit the Muslim religious faith of some of its enemies' colonial populations. This attempt took many forms, but one particularly active side of German activity was in prisoner of war camps. The German army made much of the soldiers it captured from among the enemy troops, often subjecting Africans and Asians to anthropological study in the camps and using images of the prisoners in propaganda. The Germans also gathered together in one special camp, near Berlin, all the Muslim prisoners of war captured from the Russian, French, and British armies. This half-moon camp, named for the Muslim symbol of the crescent moon, was the site of an aggressive propaganda campaign to convince these men to switch sides and fight against their colonial masters. After all, Germany was allied with the Muslim Ottoman Empire, and the Sultan in Constantinople had declared jihad, calling all the faithful to fight the Ottomans' enemies. These efforts mostly failed, as did other German attempts to encourage the Muslim populations of the Russian Caucasus, British India, and French North Africa to rise up en masse in the name of Islam. But the effort was a serious one and demonstrated the important role non-European peoples and lands played in geostrategy during the conflict. Conclusion: race and racism helped shape both the approaches of combatant nations to waging World War I and the experience of the war for millions of people among the European public and in European colonies in Africa and Asia. From the color of their skins to the content of their religious beliefs, colonized peoples' attributes were of major concern to those making decisions about how and where to wage war. In fact, the very racial and cultural differences of non-European peoples gave European colonial powers a sense of entitlement to rule their colonial possessions in the first place. Then, during the war, these differences justified making use of Africans and Asians as workers, soldiers, and objects of European strategy. The following slides illustrate race in World War I through images with extended descriptions. World War I has been called the Great War and the war to end all wars. Upon entering the conflict in 1917, the U.S. government began to describe it as a war to make the world safe for democracy. To sell the war to an isolationist American public, the Committee on Public Information, under the direction of George Creel, undertook a massive propaganda campaign defaming German Huns and extolling American heroism. Published in Chicago in 1918 by Charles Gustrein, this poster shows African American soldiers routing their German foes beneath a head and shoulders portrait of Abraham Lincoln with the quote, "Liberty and freedom shall not perish." Despite this noble sentiment, many Black soldiers faced discrimination, segregation, and the threat of violence after completing their service and returning to their homes. The American Red Cross was one of the first support organizations approached by Black women seeking to help the war effort. In many northern cities, they worked side by side with white women, while in the South, Black women served in segregated units, such as the Booker T. Washington branch in Tampa, Florida. Excluded from national service until June 1918, Black women eventually served in 6 Black base hospitals registered by the American Red Cross that served approximately 38,000 Black soldiers. While few Black nurses were called to overseas duty before the armistice, it is estimated that over 300 Black nurses served overseas by passing for white. This photograph from a postcard shows Red Cross workers at a surgical dressing unit in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1918. Perhaps the most iconic image from the Great War is of trench warfare. Long periods of waiting were punctuated by bloody forays into no man's land, between enemy lines, where countless men could be killed in a matter of minutes. Neither side, however, was able to overwhelm the other's lines, and the front remained static for years. Between deadly attempts to break the stalemate, soldiers in the trenches suffered from miserable conditions, inclement weather, and a number of diseases. This photograph from the Western Front shows African American and Black French colonial soldiers in a French trench. African American soldiers fought nobly in the war, but were usually better recognized by foreign governments than by the United States. Many, in fact, received a hostile and violent reception after the pomp and circumstance ended, and they returned to their former lives. Despite the hopes of many Black soldiers and volunteers, race relations in America were not improved by African American sacrifices in the Great War. Of the 382 known Black lynching victims between 1914 and 1920, some were recently discharged soldiers still wearing their uniforms. Still, Black veterans were rightfully proud of their service. This picture from 1941 shows Mr. Max Kelly at his home in Heard County, Georgia, beside a picture of himself in his World War I uniform.